Good morning, Representatives Surridge, Corey, and Irich. Thank you for taking the time to meet with us today. Long gone are the days when a school could slap some apples on a poster asking for donations and the money would come rolling in. My name is Krista Benavides, and I live in, and I have 2 children enrolled in the Wilcox Unified School District.
And I'm Regina Ortega-Leonardi from a product of Globe Unified School District.
And I'm Monica Timberlake. I'm the governing board president from Quartzsite Elementary School District.
Together today, we're going to talk to you about equality in education for Arizona's smaller school districts and ask you to make some changes to the Arizona Revised Statute 15949 to bridge a current funding gap because it is time to redo the math. This change will help the state move forward to ensure that every child has equality in education and guarantee funding for small rural school districts that is equal to the wealthier and larger school districts in our state. In the beginning, communities established what we now call school districts. Within each district, the local citizens banded together to equally share the cost by opting to tax themselves to educate their children. An example of what that would have looked like, I just want you to imagine like Laura Ingalls in Little House on the Prairie. In November of 1867, the Pima County School Board of Supervisors created the very first school district within the Arizona Territory. It was a 1-room schoolhouse and it held 55 students. Sadly, after only 4 months, it closed for what else? A lack of funding. 3 years after that, the Phoenix Elementary School District was created, and this was the very first free public school system within our territory. The system of funding schools was set up to have an equal balance where each district was paying for students to be properly educated through their property by taxing property owners. And in theory, this was a great solution. The system, however, proved to be brimming with imbalance, and disproportions of people, land, and wealth created large disparities between each of the districts. Districts with large amounts of property value, heavy concentrations of industry and wealth, and then as well as having a small tax rate, were able to generate huge amounts of revenue and make large expenditures. The poorer districts had much larger tax rates, but still could not generate nearly as much money because their land values were very much lower. So in almost all of these cases, these poor districts were in fact your small rural districts. So this lopsided funding model remained in place for 146 years. In 1976, a California lawsuit, which was Serrano versus Priest, led to a change of the education funding system around the country. After the California Supreme Court ruled that the existing practice of funding schools solely based on property wealth within a district violated equal protection clause of the state constitution. The court said that property tax rates and per student cost needed to be equalized by the actual state. As similar lawsuits popped up across the country and similar funding systems were ruled against by the court systems, the Arizona legislature stepped in and instituted the school funding system in 1980. It was designed to replace this unfair system that was based solely on the property tax with one where the state actually contributed to ensure that all school districts were provided funding that allowed for a general and uniform education. This is the current base system that we still have in place today. However, instead of being equitable, there are in fact loopholes. And these are creating inequities and allowing some districts to have access to greater sums of money than others. So then we throw in budget overrides and bond elections that schools districts seek, but they have a really difficult time getting passed. And what was once actually a level playing field is now tilted in the favor of a few larger, wealthier districts.
So in 1985, the state of Arizona created the Education Equalization Formula, which is the mainframe for determining state funding for school districts and charters. The formula serves two purposes, a state aid payment calculation and a budget limit for districts. 125 student per district was the magic number set way back when that allows Arizona's smallest school districts to prosper. Small rural school districts receive funds for having 125 students or less by being able to levy an additional property tax for costs like teachers and transportation, STEM programs and technology, and textbooks, which access to in a rural school can prove costly and pose budget challenges for small school districts. This old school formula is antiquated. It has not been overhauled in over 40 years. It was designed before other school choice options were part of the equation. As those options were added, the formula was not revised, instead just tweaked to squeeze these new schools in. What we found is a funding gap affecting school districts, mostly rural, across the state. Small schools have fallen into a void, somewhere between 125.1 and 250 student population. After 250 students, the system largely balances itself out. However, within the gap, resources that normally would aid in the learning process for these schools fall off, and these schools struggle. Good plumbing but terrible water pressure is how Chris Cotterman, the Director of Governmental Relations for the Arizona School Board Association, recently described the small school district funding formula. He stated that education dollars in Arizona do follow the student, and they do flow into those districts that have 125 students or less, or 250 or more students in their population. However, the money stops flowing and the water pressure is gone for those school districts that have a student population that falls in the gap. So how does a school end up with 125.1 of anything? Arizona uses objective and measurable student characteristics as weights. A number is assigned, for example, when identifying grade level, socioeconomic status, English language learners, students with disabilities, low academic performers, high achievers, just to name a few. Now, nearly 50% of rural students live in poverty. Over 13% of rural students have IEPs, which indicate that the students require some form of special education services. And almost 14% of rural students are English language learners. So for a rural school district, these weights fall heavy. The school population count goes up, and any school district that ends up with point anything above 125 students will lose money. Case in point, Siloam Elementary. A couple of years ago, their head count came in at 125.67 students. Using the current formula, the school did not qualify for additional funds, and they lost out on $300,000 for the following year's budget. This led to a loss of inability to fill positions, combined classes, and it affected the quality of education for the students as well as the workload for the staff. They had to keep the school afloat with fewer paddles. We recently checked back in with Siloam Elementary, and since then they have fallen below the 125 number. So they are concerned, though, year upon year, what side of the formula they're going to land on, and that just creates concern for them if they'll have to make budget cuts or not. Inadequate funding is one of the most significant barriers small school districts face. On average, rural districts receive just a small fraction of state education funding when it does pour out. There are over 110 small school districts in Arizona that fall within this funding gap, and they do not qualify for extra funding. This no man's land is tough for a school district that is small-ish, but not small enough to receive the small school adjustment. So a concerted effort to revitalize the education equalization formula is needed in order to guarantee that students from Scottsdale to Quartzsite, Mesa to Window Rock have the opportunity to attain an excellent education.
So what we're proposing is a legislative change that would address two critical pieces of this problem. First, it would allow for additional funding for those schools that fall between 125 and 250 students. Second, because it's a tiered down approach, it will eliminate the cliff that school districts are currently facing, like Siloam, when they go over that 125 number, which results in them having to cut approximately 1/3 of their budget. The school budgets are based on the number of students a district has. The current number average is $5,710 per student. So it's then multiplied out per student to come up with your base budget. 100 students at $5,700 is much different than 1,000 students at $5,700. If the tax rate at that point doesn't allow for enough money to be collected based on your qualifying tax rate, which is set by statute, the state will then kick in some additional money to reach that budget amount. Sounds like it's a fair proposition, right? However, the challenge is that there are some fixed costs with smaller districts that don't change based on district size. And things like transportation, teachers and personnel, utilities. A school bus costs $120,000 regardless of whether you have 30 students on it or 65. Average teacher pay in Arizona right now is about $42,000, whether that teacher's teaching 15 kids or 30. Same thing with utility costs. They don't change significantly whether the classroom is half full or full. So when you bring all those in, obviously a district with 100 kids versus a district with 1,000 kids, there are not as many ways to allocate those same resources to cover those base costs. So as I mentioned, what we're asking for is a tiered down approach. So a school district with 125 students would have the amount to potentially do a budget override or a tax levy, up to 100% of their budget. After that, it would drop off. 125 to 150 would allow you to do 75% of your budget. 175 to 200 would be 50% of your budget. 200 to 250 students would be 25% of your budget. This would eliminate that huge drop that districts are currently facing. So does the math work? Well, interestingly enough, if you do the 5,700 times 100% additional funding, you come up with 1,427. If you do it times 175 students with the 50% additional funding, you're at 1.498. And then once you hit that 250 mark, without any additional funding, you're right at that 1.4 million again. So all of those numbers, you can see that levels out that playing field to cover those fixed costs. So additionally, to create a system with some checks and balances, we propose that this plan would actually need to be approved by your local board of supervisors. Districts under 125 can currently levy any amount up to the tax cap without any oversight. So the tax cap would still apply. However, we suggest that with this one, the local school district would have to justify to their local county supervisors why they need the money and what they need it for. This provides some accountability to the taxpayers with this tax levy. So we've thrown around a lot of numbers, a lot of percentages, but what does it really look like to a taxpayer? So for my school district, we'd have the ability to ask for an additional $1.25 million in funding based on our current budget. However, just because we can ask for that much doesn't mean we would. Even a 30% increase in our budget would be about $500,000. That would allow us to do increased pay and benefits, intervention for struggling students, STEM music programs, things that the kids in the urban cities often have that our rural kids aren't able to take advantage of. What does it look like for a taxpayer? This is based on my personal property, and mine's fairly average for Quartzsite. My assessed value of my property is $107,356. That's not market value, that's what it's assessed at. $1,319 per year in property taxes. $309 of that is what goes to my local elementary school. A 30% increase would be an additional 70 cents per $100 on the assessed value. $760 per month, or $7.60 per month. What could I do with $8 a month? I could buy Starbucks. I could buy McDonald's. Maybe a cool light strip for the living room. My school district could buy textbooks. They could buy computers. They can get teachers in classrooms that we so desperately need. So what we're asking for is for you to revise Statute 15949 with the proposition you have in front of you to level the playing field for Arizona rural schools. Any questions?
Thank you. That is time.